Welcome to Behavioral Health Today, a podcast brought to you by the Triad Network. This podcast is designed to share trending topics occurring within the world and our communities and bring them a behavioral and mental health perspective.
Welcome to Behavioral Health Today. I'm your host, Sharlee Dixon. My guest today is Garrett Wood. Garrett is an executive well-being coach, certified clinical hypnotherapist, and executive function specialist. With over 18 years of experience helping high-performing professionals reclaim balance, fulfillment, and well-being. As the founder of Gnosis Therapy, he combines evidence-based coaching, hypnotherapy, and therapeutic techniques to address burnout, chronic stress, and imposter syndrome. Garrett's holistic approach empowers clients to achieve sustainable success without sacrificing their health, happiness, or relationships, guiding them to turn burnout into breakthrough. In today's conversation, we'll dive into Garrett's unique approach, exploring how he blends hypnotherapy, coaching, and the 7 drivers of mental wellness to help high achievers move beyond burnout, rewire limiting beliefs, and build lasting mental wellness from the inside out. In today's conversation, we'll dive into Garrett's unique approach, exploring how he blends hypnotherapy, coaching, and the 7 drivers of mental wellness to help high achievers move beyond burnout, rewire limiting beliefs, and build lasting mental wellness from the inside out. Thank you so much for coming on the show, Garrett. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Sharlee. I'm so excited to be here today.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I really want to start with your journey, take it back a little bit. What inspired you to create Gnosis Therapy and focus on the intersection between hypnotherapy and mental wellness?
Yeah, I mean, before I've ever been a practitioner, I've always been on the receiving end of the therapeutic services, whether that's health and fitness or somatic body work, but also hypnotherapy. It was a pretty powerful tool for my own journey, and it was pretty interesting to me. I was working in a pretty large corporate environment, overseeing a lot of people working long hours, and we were specializing in health and wellness for a lot of corporate professionals. And it was interesting because they're there, they have all the time and money now finally in their career to like begin to reinvest in themselves for their own health that they'd given up in the pursuit of their financial success. And we were telling them, hey, you got to sleep more, we got to eat, we got to worry about the nutrition. And they were getting results and they're feeling better, but there was something that was still kind of keeping them stuck in their health and wellness there. And then for me and myself, it's a hospitality industry. We are open 7 days a week. We are open 5 a.m. to like 11 p.m. So it felt like I was always on call. And with a large staff of like 100-ish people across 7 locations, there's always felt like there was some crisis somewhere that I needed to be personally in the middle of. And so it was really interesting talking about all this health and wellness all day. And then your own life not really reflecting that personally at all. Yeah, I felt a little imposter there, a little fraudulent, but eventually it started to take a toll on my physical health. Back pain, knee pain, my interpersonal relationships were struggling. And then even with my team, where I was really trying to show up and be like an attuned leader to them, my fears, my frustrations, my anxieties was getting the best of me. And after I went and got some support for myself, not only did our bottom line increase and the effortfulness of what it felt like to do the job every day decreased for me, I saw those relationships with my team completely change. And I saw that they had less stress. So it's pretty interesting as the leader, you know, you're passionate, you're driven, but like more often than not, your own regulation or dysregulation might end up being the bottleneck for everything around you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting being the leader of a large group of people. And like you said, how you approach life can really tend to affect how your employees, your people that you're working with, how they see life as well. That's an interesting idea to me.
Yeah. Sometimes people talk about like, oh, you know, we need to lead by example and not like sending out emails at 10 o'clock at night or, 2 in the morning, whatever it may be.
Yeah.
And you'll hear a lot of leaders like, well, I just can't turn my brain off. So I'm out there doing it. I don't expect them to respond, but we're so intuitive as like social creatures that we learn by what we see demonstrated more than by, what the policies say. And if your own feelings, your own passion kind of bleeds over and you don't have boundaries in place, it's really dangerous. I mean, I'm talking about my own experience, but that's true for most of the clients I work with.
I think that's a large part of, especially people in corporate situations or people that have, high-powered, focused jobs. In production is a high thing. It is. I think that's across the board, not just your personal experience there for sure.
Yeah. And so we saw that with the people that we were working with.
Mhm.
And then I was working with someone who, on paper, he always looked like he was doing really well. He'd been with the organization for about 20 of their 25 years. And every time we like pulled up the profit and loss statements or the production sheets, his name was always at the top. So he was kind of someone we all emulated, wanted to be like. And anytime we were having a bad day, we'd look to him and be like, well, he seems to have it all together. So, all right, it must just be me. I got to figure this out on my own. Right. But I was in a meeting with his replacement because he'd been let go suddenly. And like 2 weeks later, I'm sitting in a meeting, production meeting with his replacement. And we got news that after 20 years of being at that organization, giving so much of himself and his identity, his time, building those relationships, all that he did, without that in his life, he didn't really feel like there was enough left over for him that made his life worth living. And so it was a really big wake up call for all of us, but I especially was like, wow, okay, I know I'm struggling, and the person who I thought wasn't struggling is now no longer with us. Like we are all in this. This is a much more systemic issue than what I originally thought.
Absolutely. So that kind of brings me to the name of your agency, Gnosis, with the silent G. It's kind of intriguing to me when I first saw it. I'm like, God, that's interesting. I wonder, what does that mean? So what does Gnosis mean to you? How does it capture the essence of your work? How did you come up with it?
So, names are always kind of fun and silly. I wouldn't recommend ever doing a silent letter in any of your business names just for business purposes. So for those future practitioners out there that are going to be independent, maybe don't make silent letters in your domain. But for me, my name's Garrett. So G starts with G. That's nice. Hypnosis is a pretty big, powerful tool that I use in my practice. And Gnosis rhymes with hypnosis. So that was nice as well. But the actual term, the Greek meaning of that is this embodied knowledge. So a lot of times people know what they should be doing, should in scare quotes there. And then they see their behavior and they're frustrated by that gap and that cognitive dissonance that they're experiencing, like is always like egging them on in the background and kind of causing some dysregulation. But when you have a felt sense of knowing, there's a lot less of a gap between that, like, I want to be doing this, I can be doing this, and then this is what I'm actually doing. When your identity, for example, like, I don't smoke is very different than saying like, no, thank you to a cigarette is very different than like, I'm a non-smoker. Like the I'm a non-smoker is like a positive identity statement
Mhm.
versus saying like, no, thank you, or not today, or I'm trying to quit, or like, it's almost indicative of the internal representation you have of yourself and what you think. And that I would say is like the gnosis of knowing that I'm a non-smoker. Like I believe it to be true. I feel it in my actions, my words are a reflection of that state. And so that's kind of the idea behind gnosis of what it should experience wise.
And I'm really glad I asked that question because I was really thinking like he's just doing a play off of hypnosis. I really did not realize that that was a real term. Interesting. Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that you wanted to dig deeper in this type of work because a lot of the people that you work with, including yourself, were starting to have physical symptoms, maybe some sleep issues, physical body aches, maybe even some burnout. But of course, there are deeper emotional layers that are always at play below those things. What patterns were you noticing beneath those surface symptoms when you first began your practice in 2018?
So in 2018, people walked in, neck pain, shoulder pain. They've gone through the traditional medical route. They've seen their doctors of physical
Mhm.
therapy. They've had imaging. There's nothing going on. We put in some tissue tension. We do some manual therapy stuff. And as they're kind of sitting there going through it, like, oh, it starts to feel better. All of a sudden, they're like, start talking to you a little bit more about a story that's going on. They're like, this kind of reminds me of this time with my brother back in, whatever year. And this thing happened. And my shoulder kind of like, and all of a sudden, they're bringing up this story and the sensation or sensorial experience along with the sensation they're feeling from that touch. And all of a sudden, something happens. We're like pulling up that memory, that past experience, bringing it into the present moment. And it's triggered through that sensorial sensation. And now something changes. We put it back in and they move on. And all of a sudden, their shoulders feels different. It's stronger. There's less weakness. It's easier for them to access some of that strength. And there's something going on with that story piece. And it's not just in like somatic touch, like hot, cold, slap, tickle, poke, itch, all the different feelings we have in our skin. It's also emotions, anger, frustration, shame, guilt, fear. And I think a lot of times when we're in scenarios that trigger those emotions, our body has a reaction. but also that story gets amplified and we're like back in it again, living it all over. And our body's trying to protect us from that subconsciously in any way. So it moves us away, just like your body moves away from pain. And I think that that piece is really interesting because when we started talking about the emotions that tied into some of those stories or other experiences, we saw the same thing happen. We're talking about the story, we bring up the emotion, we kind of do some emotional regulation strategies. When that story goes away, the next time it feels easier when it comes on. It's almost like the soundtrack changes, right? Instead of a horror movie or like a thriller, it's
Right.
maybe a drama, which is a step in the right direction. Maybe it's almost a rom-com. Maybe it's almost PG-13 or G, Yeah, it depends on how many times they've gone through that process.
Interesting. So I want to learn more about that specific process, that I guess that therapeutic blend itself, where you are weaving the clinical hypnotherapy, somatic touch with the talk therapy. I'm very interested in how that creates a more holistic experience for clients, especially because it seems that, our bodies do store a lot of, unreleased emotions. Can you talk to us a bit more about that process?
Yeah, there's an example like if we're using an athlete as an example, right? And they have an ACL tear. If that ACL tear has been repaired, it's been healed, they're out there, they're going back to sport, and all of a sudden they're like, knee always feels weak. If they're in the same environment where they had that injury, there's a bunch of sensorial experiences that were reminding them of how dangerous that can be. And that is like a perception thing that's operating all the time to keep us safe. Like, I don't remember when I was a child, I don't know if you know, when the first time you touched something that was hot that would burn you. The first time, hopefully it's mom or someone who cares for you is like, hey, don't do that, it's hot. And then you're like maybe mischievous and reaching out and touching it yourself. And then it burns you and then you pull away. But now as an adult, you start reaching for something and you feel the heat. You immediately pull away. You feel pain. But when you look down, there's no burn. That pain is there before you actually even had the tissue damage. It's there as like a preemptive signal. And so that process is really powerful. So back to the ACL injury, if they're smelling AstroTurf, they will actually have an inability to recruit their maximum strength through that leg because the association of that smell from the olfactory with that injury is the signal that the body uses to determine if this is safe or not. Can I express my strength here, or is it safer for me to retreat, just like our hand off that stove? And so when we're doing interventions, is it primarily a somatic physical injury that they went through? Is it an emotional one that they went through? Is it more from like a one-time event into a belief that they have about themselves, others in the world? Or is it like a different sensorial thing where they have a high threshold for sensory experiences or low, and their day-to-day environments is at odds with that? So we do a lot of assessments through the 7 kind of different drivers. And then once we kind of know what their unique nervous system needs are and where their challenges are, we think about common ways that they can accommodate it really practically. And then hopefully try to align their work moving forward in ways that meet those accommodations.
It's a very interesting way to look at how to, that full mind body wellness idea. I really like it. So I do want to dive a bit deeper into your framework, the 7 drivers of mental wellness. Can you give us an overview of what they are and how they came to shape your therapeutic model?
Yeah. So I'll start at the top and work my way down. Sorry, it's 7. That's a lot. I apologize for everybody out there. So we have sensory intelligence, which is not my idea. That's an doctor of occupational therapy, Anne-Marie Lombard out of South Africa. She's a doctor of OT, and she looked at not just like sensory processing disorder, but the sensory profiles that people have. So even if you don't qualify for the full criteria to meet a diagnosis, that doesn't mean you don't have preferences. That doesn't mean you don't have thresholds. So for some people that get overstimulated really easily by sounds, by vision, by vestibular things, putting them in an environment where they're required to do that, like having them work on a fairgrounds, would be detrimental to their health. The level of stress they're going to experience in that day, it's going to take its toll. They might get 90 days before they're fried from that. And it kind of harkens back to the marshmallow experiment where you got the little 4-year-olds and they gave them the marshmallow and they said like, hey, if you don't eat the marshmallow, we'll give you another one. And then they followed up with those kids, and the ones that said no to the marshmallow did really well in school and really successful relationships. They followed up with some of the kids that didn't do so well. And after doing them a battery of tests and trying to figure out what they all had kind of something in common, one of the findings that they found is that the sensory environment that they were testing the kids in, which was a classroom setting, was not aligned with their needs. The lights were too much. The hardness of the table was too much. The temperature of the room. And so those sensory mismatches were so acute for those kids, and they're 4, so they don't have a lot of regulation skills at that point. But it was so challenging for them, it diminished their ability to express whatever executive functioning capacity they did have. It just got turned all the way down. So they couldn't delay that gratification. So it's almost like we think of grit as like a moral character trait or like a strength. But what it really seems to be is like a physiological function of being in a non-stressed environment. And the more stressed you are, the harder it is to express those things, the harder it is to be gritty or have willpower, determination, or to be able to use your executive functions to the best of their ability. So I've seen that with a lot of the professionals that I work with. The work environment doesn't match up with what they need. And that mismatch is really making it hard for them at the end of the day. They just feel like they got ran over by the time they get home. And they noticed it when they switched from like COVID, when people started going remote, because all of a sudden they had an experience of what it meant to work a full work week from home. And some people thrived and others crumbled. And they were like trying to figure out what the heck is happening here. Why is it so great for these people and so terrible for these ones? And it seems like some of that sensory threshold, that sensory intelligence work is playing a part. So that's one big component of the 7. So the second one that we kind of look at after that is our ability to experience positive and negative emotions, right? So we're using that PANAS, like how frequently are you experiencing positive emotions on a weekly basis? How hard is it for you to actually get access to anything that is enjoyable? And it's not necessarily the experiences they're having now in this moment. It's their ability to recall a time that they had a positive experience and bring that feeling and that sensation back into a present moment. You know, maybe you were looking at the Grand Canyon, you're just like awe and wonder and gratitude. And, you know, you're in a board meeting with 50 people and you're like, this is not the Grand Canyon. But can we like go to that memory, that image, that feeling, and bring some of it along with us, no matter where we're at? If we can't access that pretty easily, it's going to be challenging for that person to interact and be resilient in the world day to day. And so some of that work is going back in and finding those things that really make it easy for them to access those moments and then bringing that along. And then alternatively, when they're in a really challenging situation, can we practice some emotional regulation techniques and skills and kind of build those up so they get a little bit more of a refined emotional palette? It's not just sad, bad, glad. It's like, you know, more nuanced than that. Like people are trying to be a sommelier, but instead of with wine, it's with their emotions. So hopefully they can be a little bit more effective. Yeah.
Right. So then can you give us a few techniques there that you use or even some quick things that listeners may be able to do to bring about a more positive emotional response or a remembrance? I'm a social worker. And so there are times that I'm not necessarily in a board meeting. I am in the dialysis clinic where I have 40 sick people in a room and I am trying to share positivity. And it is hard for me to bring it from my own life to share and continue to be positive with people who are struggling. So what are some techniques that maybe I or even some other professionals might be able to use?
Yeah. So I think one of the things I've seen, like for a whole go get a workbook and like work all the way through it, would be the appreciative inquiry, which is like a nice kind of pretty interesting way to dive deep into that. We're looking back, like when was a time where it felt different than it does now? Tell me more about that. What was your favorite part about it? And what did you use in that moment to bring about or contribute to your experience of that? And sometimes just reminding people that they've had a good time and that they had agency in creating that for themselves is like just enough to crack open that door that we can work with that to create more opportunities to experience it. I will say though, if someone is in a distressed state and you're trying to do that work with them, I have not found it personally to be very effective. And so anytime we're looking at trying to bring a tool or a technique, I always try to remind myself that if we can get regulated first, myself, right? Like I talked about being the bottleneck at work and I was the jerk and so everyone else was not okay. Then can we get regulated with them? Can we co-regulate? Can I attune to them? Can we get them in some type of state that's just a little bit more parasympathetic? And then from there, can we talk about this experience? Because then we can move into like, oh, well, what can we do now? Yeah, you're experiencing dialysis and this is not an ideal scenario that you didn't plan on ever being in. But is there a part of your day-to-day, week to week now that we can make that's going to be more impactful? We can start that reasoning process. or even doing that like CBT at that point. Once they're already regulated, you already feel that rapport and attunement. Yeah. And to get into that regulated state, that's where we do a lot of that somatic regulation. So, depending on who they are, how mobile they are, the environment, it looks very different. Dialysis machines and corporate boardrooms, we'd have to make that regulating tool match the environment that they find themselves in when they need that tool. So it's pretty individualized that way. But anything that increases HRV is a pretty cool, powerful tool. I'm a big fan of anything that does that. It's just trying to figure out which one's the right one for them in that moment to help them be successful.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So subconscious beliefs are limiting beliefs, right? So this is a little bit tapping on like schema therapy. There's the cognitive belief inventory that's out there where they kind of come up with these big 10 I am statements, or the world is, or others are. And a lot of that is like intuitive things. My favorite like cute example of this is one of my friends has a 5-year-old, and he said out loud, as a 35-year-old man with all of his heart in true belief, his gnosis, that if you eat your pizza crust, it'll give you curly hair. And when he said it out loud, he knew it's not true. He was like, that is so silly. I can't believe it. And he knew like, I believe this to be true. And I know absolutely there's no way that that's true. But when he was 5, his dad had told him that. And at that moment, he'd chosen like that affection to be like his dad sharing that moment with him was so impactful that he just stored that away as true for the rest of his life until he was 30 years later. And it came out in a moment. And so I often wonder how many other beliefs we have like that we're carrying around that like, that's a pretty harmless one. Like it's a pretty innocuous one. It's kind of cute, but there are a lot of other beliefs that we're probably carrying around that aren't so innocuous, that aren't so cute. Yeah. They may have been like helpful then, but they're probably harmful now because as we grow and change and develop and our environment we find ourselves in changes, we need ability to adapt those beliefs and update them and challenge them. And so once we kind of identified what they are, we can go through and be like, okay, well, what's still serving me about this belief? What's no longer serving me? And so that's kind of like a journaling process. The clients kind of go through that and we recap on their findings. And then we kind of put in little challenges like, okay, how do we challenge this belief? How do we decide? Is there evidence to believe it still or not? And how can we do that in a way that feels safe enough to try, to like actually go out and experiment in the real world? And then what did we find? And then anytime they get a little too intimidated, it feels a little scary, we just do some of those regulation techniques and we try it again. Maybe we go back and do it in our imagination, or that would be our focus for that hypnotherapy session where we're taking them through those experiences.
Actually, okay, interesting. That reshaping of the beliefs, it is something that has to be done. First of all, identifying it is really. Would you find that it's harder to identify or to reframe or reshape them?
So it's really hard to reshape beliefs, even if you know them. Yeah. Because if you believe it to be true and it feels true to you, your behaviors, conscious and subconscious, kind of reflect those beliefs. And you go out and interact with the world. And then people are like in an improvisational dance with your demeanor, with your beliefs. And so they're reacting and responding according to a part that you're providing for them and then their own version of that. And then if we have that filter, we're filtering for our confirmation biases. We're literally looking more for the evidence that confirms what we already believe. It's so challenging to look for evidence that doesn't feel good when we experience it, where it doesn't feel comfortable. Even if that belief isn't a comforting thought, even if it creates dread and anxiety, it's still easier for our brain to choose to believe that and reinforce it than it is to try to create a whole new network to run and filter through the world on. And so you're really trying to fight against your own biology there. Yeah. And yes, like neuroplasticity is a thing, but that doesn't mean it's easy. And so it does take a lot of intentionality. And so I enjoy doing it on a conscious process, like calling it out, creating a challenges, going out in the real world, and then a subconscious one where we're doing that in a really relaxed nervous system in hypnotherapy. Because if we're in a relaxed nervous body and we're going through those things, our brain now has an experience of doing the thing and not feeling stressed about it. And so now it gives us an opportunity to kind of feel a little bit different. And in our imagination, we can imagine it going really well even. So now we even have a more positive experience. So then when we go out and act, the hope is that it makes it easier to act in that new way, that new belief, that new behavior, with less distress for the nervous system.
Right. Interesting. Okay. Nice. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. And then
Mhm.
that's subconscious beliefs. Next one would be kind of attachment styles. Typically with the population I work with, they're leaders. So they're embedded in an organization. I'm not working with a whole team. Typically, I'm usually working with the leader. But if they don't know their own kind of attachment style, their behaviors with one of their team members, and then that team member's interpretation of that behavior is really interesting. Because you'll see the same manager who gets accused of being a micromanager by one team member, and then
Mhm.
also being like a sink or swim manager by another team member.
Mhm.
And their behavior is probably not that different, at least from what they share with me. I'm not in the room, so I don't know, right? But if they're working with someone who's got a little bit more anxious attachment style, or they're working with someone who's a little bit more avoidant, that kind of influences how their experience of that interaction kind of feels, especially when we're in a state of stress, especially when people aren't well fed, well slept, project deadlines are coming up, and the stakes
Mhm.
feel really high, and people really care. They're so dysregulated that like our own insecurities come out in those moments. And I think leaders often think that their primary job is the work, but really their primary job is
The
to
people.
like, yeah, and not just the people, but can you be calm enough, regulated enough that you can create a space for that person to be distressed and then get back to neutral so that way they
Mm.
can actually be the best version of themselves and then go and do the work in a collaborative, productive manner. Because if they're up here, you're getting them probably at like 20% of what they're capable of, just like those 4-year-olds with the marshmallows. They're no
Yeah.
longer able to use their executive function to do the task. It's so effortful. When you think you're in a ruptured relationship with your leader, it's so challenging to try to continue to move forward with any type of passion or care and concern for the work. And that's like, there's some of those articles out there in like Fast Company and Forbes that talk about your relationship with your leader is more important than the one you have with your partner at home. And it's more important than the one you have with your therapist because it can affect your mood more than anything.
Oh, yeah.
Uh, and if you think about it, you're probably at work more than you are at home for most
Nope.
people.
Most of us. In a waking time, at least for sure. Yeah.
Absolutely. And like conscious interaction where you're like trying to be
Mhm.
fully present to do something as an
Yeah.
outcome. Yeah. And so that
Mhm.
attachment awareness, I think, is really important for leaders to understand that if they can figure out their own style
Mhm.
of approaching, and then they can kind of be aware enough to stay inside of what's appropriate for them, but to be aware of things that they can do to try to help make it easier for other people to be attuned to them and then to them. It makes it much easier to get there, feel that relationship, and then move forward with the work first.
We'll be right back after a word from our sponsor.
Are you preparing for a licensure exam in psychology, social work, marriage and family therapy, counseling, or behavioral analysis? AATBS is here to help. We have been supporting behavioral and mental health students to prepare for their licensure exams for more than 45 years, working with over 1 million students to succeed on test day and move on to the next step in their career. With products ranging from comprehensive courses to quiz banks and delivered live online, self-study online, and in print, AATBS has test prep solutions that meet every student's needs and learning styles. Visit us today at aatbs.com. That's aatbs.com and use promo code BHT15 to save 15% off your next purchase.
Got you. So then do you work with those leaders, those professionals to figure out what their employees or coworkers, what those attachment styles are? Is that important, or is it just more important for people to figure out what theirs are to be able to work within, those limitations?
Yeah, so some of that we just start with what theirs are, awareness of the big blocks of concepts and what those
Yeah.
behaviors look like and what the kind of protest behaviors are. And we take them through their history. Like, describe to me all of the leaders you've worked with before, because you weren't born a leader, you learned it from other people. And then eventually they'll be like, oh, well, who was your first leaders? Which are usually our parents or our caregivers at a
Mhm.
young age, maybe a teacher or two or a coach. And we think about the positive and negative experiences that they've had with those. And that gives them a nice, full, more robust idea about how their personal attachment style shows up in all of those relationships, professional and personal. And then we can imagine, well, what was the difference between this and that style? What was the difference between this and that style? Because a lot of people are just like, oh, no, they're a good manager. They're a bad manager. And that's
Mhm.
like, are they a good and bad manager for everybody? Like, do we all agree?
Right.
Or like, what? There's something going on there. I feel like that's just too easy of an answer, and it's not generous enough to
Mhm.
the people that are really trying to do the best they can for the people they care about, and they know that because they feel that about their team. And so it kind of works as a little bit of self-compassion as we do that work for themselves, because they're able to go back and be like, oh, that leader wasn't for me. Oh, that leader didn't provide the environment I need. And then often the insight comes out like, oh, I'm not a bad manager. I'm just not the
Yeah.
best manager for this person that
That
they need.
person. Mhm.
Maybe they're not a no good, very bad person, and I'm not a no good, very bad person. Maybe we're just not working well together and we got to figure this out a little bit different. What are some tools and strategies to make it easier for both of us? And that sometimes is enough, because we don't need to be perfect to do this work. We just have to be better than we were yesterday. And it's usually really appreciated. Every little effort in those environments like does carry a lot of ripple effects outside.
It definitely does. Because, like you mentioned, I know I personally spend much more time either on the commute or at work than I do in waking focused, having expectations all the time at work versus when I'm at home, when you can be more free. Of course, there are expectations there too, but it's a different level of expectation for sure.
Yeah, there's a little bit more acceptance at home, right?
Mhm.
Like you're like, hey, you're having a bad day. Great. I can take care of some of that other stuff. Maybe it's not going to be a great day, but maybe it'll be less bad at least. But at
Right.
work, we would hope for that. But with staffing issues being what they are in most places, it's really challenging. And
Yeah.
the more tools and resources we have to be really effective as individuals, sometimes the more alienated we get. So we miss out on opportunities to co-regulate with people, to share in it together. So even though our efficiency goes up, our alienation does too, because we just feel like a little bit more disconnected from our colleagues or, the people we're serving even sometimes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then,
Excellent.
yeah, after attachment, we look at values and strengths. So there's
Okay.
the University of Pennsylvania, UPenn, Wharton School of Business is over there, but they also have Martin Spiegelman. I'm sure I'm not saying his name right, but he's a former president of the APA, and he talked about learned helplessness early in his career. And then later, as he was shifting out, 90s, 2000s, the aughts, he was talking a little bit more about learned optimism and how like life is hard, bad things are going to happen. We need to figure out a way to be able to account for those bad things, and the different types of approaches and attributional styles that we naturally grew up with that may be making it harder to feel successful and take those chances. Because if we're in an environment where we didn't have control and some bad things happened, it's easier to go into another environment where you might have some margin of control, but you don't try because you've learned that it's not worth the effort, that you actually need to conserve that energy to protect yourself. But then that doesn't show up as agency. And then we grow that and lean into that. We carry it to its most intense version. That pendulum swings so far, it keeps people trapped in something that they might be able to get out of, or they might be able to ask for help that might be able to help them get out of it. And so in their work, they talk about that pendulum swing from like learned helplessness to learned optimism, but they also talk about it through other strengths as well. So foolishness and courage, kind of two ends of extreme, like jumping off the cliff because you have no concern for yourself or others. So there's no fear there. And then the other person
Yeah.
who, doesn't matter if it's safer on the other side of the cliff, they're staying right there because they can't get off the cliff. And so we talk about that with the clients, like, when have you felt your best self? And I don't mean your most accomplished self, like your most accolade self. We're not like, oh yeah, I won the Nobel laureate prize in 2005, so that was the best. No, like contentment and like a hopeful gratitude, these types of feelings, right? Because we have that palette, that emotional palette refinement now a little bit. So it's not just good, bad,
Mhm.
sad. It's like
Right.
a little bit, right? And then we kind of look through those stories. If we can think about it when they were 10 or 5, when they were 20, when they're 25, when they're 55, whatever that era is. And then we can look at those stories and see themes that show up. And there's these words that continually show up for these people. And if we look at a lot of those words, they are on the like via character strengths that they offer out of there. And the more your day to day, you're able to live inside of those values that make you feel that way, the easier it is to be you. So if we know what they are and we can identify them and how they show up for you, oh, now we might be able to design like, little tips and tricks and like little things throughout your day or throughout your week where you get the chance to experience that feeling. Even if it's just for a few moments here or there, it does make a big difference in the long run over your lifetime. And the more we do it, the easier it is to do it. And the easier it is to have those feelings kind of spontaneously happen. Barbara Fredrickson's positivity is this idea of like spontaneous, positive emotional experience where the more you build and broaden that positive emotional experience, the easier it is to just experience them naturally without effort. It's almost like tilling a garden. Pull out the weeds a little bit, you plant some more of the good stuff, nourish the soil, pour some more water. Can't always control if the sun's going to come out that day or not, but you can be prepared for if it does as best as you can.
Nice.
And so that idea is pretty powerful for people. If they're in full burnout, that stuff feels very Pollyannish. It feels so like sprinkling salt and like sugar over the top of just a terrible, rotten meal that it's not going to make the difference for them. And so that's something that we kind of look a little bit later when they're feeling more agency, right? They're feeling more regulated. Their sleep is better. They're feeling like it's easy for them to access some of those emotions. Because otherwise, if you're in that dysregulated state and you try to do some of that work and then you can't find it, there's like another implicit emotion that shows up where you're like, no, I'm doing all the things and it's not working. Oh no, I must really be broken. And that's not helpful. So we're trying to stay out of that as much as possible.
Gotcha. Because that was actually going to be one of my questions, because it seems that we're getting deeper and deeper into finding those things that are, you're able to find the happiness, find the well-being, find the wellness within yourself, but you can't get there until you've gone through all the other areas of emotional regulation and finding, intelligence within yourself. So I'm glad that you pointed that out, because I agree that you cannot get there if you haven't gone through these other steps.
It's so, if you can, please let me know. I would love to see work on that. But from what the clients share, they're like, this feels silly and unserious and I don't like it. And I'm like, yeah, I get it, And so that was kind of a hard fought lesson there.
Absolutely. Because you're talking to, high performing professionals, leaders, people that are in charge of large budgets and lots of people. And so these concepts, they make sense to me as a social worker, as a practitioner, they make complete sense. But as someone who is dealing with these things on a daily basis, if they haven't gotten in touch with certain things about their emotions, it's not gonna make sense.
No, and it won't land. There won't actually be the context, I live in an area where a lot of people speak a ton of different languages. And unfortunately, I know only one and not that well. And I'm walking around and I'm hearing all these conversations, but I have no idea what they're talking about. It's like I'm not even there because I don't have the context for what those words mean, for the meaning behind it, for the feeling behind it. So it's just completely over my head all the time. And so not being able to feel really acquainted with emotions in general is really challenging for when they come up. If I don't know what this thing is, how could I ever hope to begin to regulate it or enhance it or leverage it for my benefit instead of just against it? It's really challenging if you don't have context for that. And I do think a lot of really successful driven people lean into grit, willpower, determination, this mind over matter, top down approach to living, because in the West, the ancient philosophers have been talking about reason is the thing that keeps us separate from animals. We're not animalistic. We're this rational, intelligent being. And so they've prioritized that logic, reason, and willpower over emotional experiences. And I think anytime you prioritize one over the other, we lose and sacrifice the value of both. There's a neuroscientist, researcher, Antonio Damasi's book is Descartes' Error. He talks about a couple people that had their brain injured from some TBIs where they were no longer able to experience emotions. And all they had access to was very dry logic, reason, willpower. And so he'd be like, hey, you want to come in on Tuesday or Thursday for our next interview? And they would be there for 45 minutes to an hour and a half, just going through all the data points. But they could never arrive at a conclusion to say yes or no, because there was no emotional attachment to it. And so when we think that emotions, we discount them and prioritize reason at the expense of them, we're trying to live life with one hand tied behind our back. And it's just going to be more challenging than it needs to be at the very least.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The last thing we do is executive functioning. So like we talked about with the 4-year-olds with the marshmallow, if their sensory stuff isn't aligned with their environment, that their personal needs and the environment aren't there, it's really hard for them to express their executive functioning strengths. Whatever their unique strengths are, they don't have access to them in that moment because they have more important needs to attend to. Just like my hand pulling away from the hot stove, I can't do math. I can't do my bills. I can't even see if the eggs need to be flipped or not because I am in pain. I just have to get my
Yeah.
hand out of the way. And so if we don't have all of those other things in place and we're dysregulated for all those other various reasons, it's really hard to talk about executive functioning with any real impact that people can act on. But once all that's there, it makes it really easy to be like, okay, is like task initiation easier for you or harder? Like, oh, it's really hard to get started. Okay, cool. Is it easier to finish? No, that's actually also hard too. Okay, what's the fun part that's like naturally, oh, I love all the connections of how they can relate to each other. Okay, cool. Let's start there. And then
Yeah.
do we have check-ins with people that are going to help move you along getting started? Are we going to have check-ins moving it along to getting across the finish line? Can we outsource some of that executive functioning to the people around us? Because we're not great by ourselves. You know, we're social creatures. We need other people to help us where we can't help ourselves. But if we don't know what gets us going, what makes it easier for us to use those executive functions, we're just like, I don't know, like help.
Yeah.
So we kind of go through an audit of that. We do a little assessment. We go, okay, it looks like these are your strengths. How can we do your week or that project last week that was challenging just with those? Oh, we get 75% of it done, probably just using your 4 executive functioning strengths. Okay, great. What's the other 25 that we're missing? Is there anyone else that can help us with that?
Okay.
Maybe it's sooner deadlines, right? Maybe if we're not doing good at our notes after class, we're not doing notes after our sessions. Maybe instead of them being due on Friday, we need them due at lunch every day. And someone comes in and checks on us and they just need us to, no shame, no blame, no guilt. They sit down and they're like, I'm going to do my notes. Can you do yours with me? Maybe it's something as simple as that.
Yeah.
But it's different for everybody, depending on what their strengths are in their environment, right?
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. Thank you for explaining each one of those in such detail for us. Now, I have a hypnotherapy question, and please forgive my basic knowledge of hypnotherapy. So I have done some hypnotherapy, but it was the guy comes in and he says that he can teach you how to stop eating bad food, and so then you can lose this weight because you sat through this session. But he always, and I did a few just because I was curious, I was intrigued by them, and he always has this like music playing in the background, like this audio. And I don't know if it was specific for what he was trying to get us to do or to not do. Is like an audio version or an audio component, is that something that you find important in this type of work? Do you personalize it for each client? How does that work?
Yeah. So I think that for hypnotherapy to be as robust as possible, the more sensorial experiences you can provide for somebody in a consistent way, the easier it will be to create as much attention as possible on this new behavioral change. So it's not that like this specific song is impactful, even though it might be impactful for you. You know, if I hear Britney Spears' is Toxic come on the radio, I'm paying attention. I can hear it. I can continue the words in my mind. People can be talking to me and I'll just be singing along. I'll pay attention to them because I know it so well, right? But that takes me back to an association that I have in my own life. So it's very personal that way. I don't know if I was teaching a seminar, if I'd be playing Britney Spears' is Toxic in there. It would probably be only helping me and a few other people in that room. So I don't know if there's something unique and special about the music, but if that music and that intention are there every time you practice that intention, sometimes hearing that music is enough to make it easier to access that intention in other moments where you're not in that state.
Okay.
So for like another version of hypnosis is like a rapid induction where people are like, okay, sleep. And you'll see it on like stage shows and things like that. You'll see it on like YouTube or like up close magic trick guys also do that. But a more practical version of that we've all seen is if you've watched a professional basketball game and you see that athlete on the free throw line and they bounce that basketball a couple times, they look up and then you see him bounce it again. And then they look up and you see him bounce it again. That is a cue for every single time that they have practiced that shot. They are using that sensory feedback, that sound, that feeling in their hands, that motion to get into a hyper state of awareness where they have practiced success and they can drop out. Doesn't matter who's there, does not matter what they're saying about them, does not matter all the loud noises in the background. They're right there in that moment, just them, that ball in the basket. And that's a state of hypnosis that they've practiced and it's very effective for them. I don't think anybody's talking about it like intentionality that way, but like that's what it is. That's a version of hypnosis.
That's interesting. Wow. Okay. I just thought that this was like a gimmicky thing, but it makes complete sense because you're right. I've watched sports all the time, and I always see the basketball players do that. My own child who plays basketball, he does the same thing. And so he's never mentioned that it makes him feel like he's in his own space, but I could see it because like he can't hear, like I can call his name and he won't hear me. He is
Yep, he's
just
just
there.
there. He's there. Him and the ball. Boom. Easy.
Yeah.
And it's easier to perform that way too. Because if you have everything going on, there's too much to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
All that's distracting you from that one task that you're trying to do in that moment. And our executive function is limited. So it can be really helpful for people to do that. But also being able to be in like a focused state. It's not always that like hyper on, like a sports performance kind of manner would be, or giving a speech in public speaking, or like presenting at a board meeting. Sometimes it's about recovering from those things. It's about getting back into a neutral state where, regardless of the outcome of that performance, you can feel calm and relaxed and grateful and self-assured and appreciative of yourself. And that's another state of hypnosis that people really enjoy because it's restorative. It puts them in that rest and digest, that parasympathetic state, and they're able to really restore their nervous system. Because if we're always on, which is super easy to do, and we never get a chance to like turn off or relax a little bit, it's really challenging. That chronic stress takes its toll. And the longer we're in it, the harder it is to get out of it. Right. And so being able to have like a reliable tool to be able to like on demand go in and get 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 30 minutes of that deep restorative focus and relaxation through hypnotherapy, that's therapeutic in of itself. And then if we start adding in some like positive associations, some like positive outcomes, their positive past learning and experiences where they felt some of these really enjoyable experiences and emotions, makes it even more restorative, and it makes it easier to experience all those things in the future too.
Right. On command. And just like you mentioned, this is not an easy change. I mean, change in general is not easy, but this specifically is not an easy change. Most of us in the Western world, we are dealing with chronic levels of stress from the age of young children and, up to our adulthood, especially with the types of high performers that you're working with that are navigating burnout and difficult transitions. Like, even when we know that we need change, it is difficult to do. So how are you able to help clients build enough internal resources and external support to really sustain that meaningful change?
Yeah, I'm super fortunate with the population that I work with. They're employed. They have income to like, they're doing well and they're trying to do better. And better for them isn't actually like more success at work. It's actually like better well-being for themselves. It's being able to show up as an enjoyable version of themselves because they can perform at a really high level to the point where they can tune out all of those things, all those little signals. The check engine light goes off and they just turn the radio up and keep on trucking. And that is a skill and it's helped them, but they've actually reached the point where that skill is harming them. They've reached the max capacity of that. Like the diminishing returns are just a straight cliff all the way down. And they're pretty motivated to get out of that because everything they've built relies on their ability to be able to maintain this level of success. And so it's really challenging for them because they feel that intensity and they don't know what needs to change, but they're super motivated to change and they have a lot of resources and support around them. And because they're in positions of power and authority in whatever organization they're at, they have a lot of autonomy to be able to set that like cultural trend. 2 or 3 little changes for themselves, people appreciate it and they start reflecting it. It's much more challenging if you're in a culture where you don't have autonomy, if you're in a situation where you don't have resources, where it's a really toxic environment, but there's not a whole lot you can do because you have to be there at least for this stage of your life. That's a really challenging position to be in. But I do think any of those interventions will help people. It will make it easier to get through the hard days and it will make the better days just a little bit better. But there's no such thing as like magic. It's all effort. But working on effort that like increases your well-being, I do think it gives you like, sometimes I like, I take my gym clothes and I throw them in the washer right away and I throw them in the dryer and I didn't quite take the time to like unravel the drawstring before I did all that. And sometimes I can like sneak them on up and over my thighs a little bit. Sometimes I can't, depending on the time of year. But even then you're like trying to like really undo that thing. Sometimes it would feel easier just to cut it off and like restring it or throw them away and start over. But in our life, we don't always have the opportunity to do that with our life, with our careers, with our jobs, with our families. And so we do have to sit down and like wiggle each and every little part of that knot to see what actually happens. But if we do enough of it and we're in a regulated enough state to be able to keep doing that work, eventually it just unravels. It just happens. Yeah.
Nice. Very nice analogy. Very nice. So finally, Garrett, for listeners who really resonate with this type of approach, where can they learn more about you and your work with Gnosis Therapy?
Yeah, if they're interested and they want to be very professional, they can follow me on the professional platform LinkedIn at Gnosis Therapy. If they want to be a little bit more personable, they can follow me on Instagram at Gnosis Therapy, or they can go out and reach out to my website, which is gnosistherapy.com.
Awesome. Awesome. All right. Well, Garrett, thank you. I have really appreciate you speaking with us today.
Thank you so much for having me on. I was really excited to be here.
Absolutely. And thank you to our listeners for taking the time to join us. Make sure to follow us on our social media at Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, YouTube, and more at Behavioral Health Today. And if you like our show, make sure to give us 5 stars and leave us a review. As always, the resources for this episode and an archive of all of our other episodes can be found on our webpage at triadhq.com/BHT. And we look forward to having you back with us next time on Behavioral Health Today.
We appreciate all the support from our community, and if you like our show, one of the best ways you can support it is by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review. Behavioral Health Today is a podcast part of the Triad Behavioral Health Network, all rights reserved.